Hello and happy Sunday. Happy Labor Day weekend. Happy September. There's a lot to celebrate and to stay positive about. I really have the honor of welcoming a lot of dear colleagues by now and new friends to this incredible series called the Hot Topics series. And I really wanted to give a bit of context as well as the warmest possible welcome. The Hudson Eye was born after about 14, 15 years of activity in town in Hudson. And the nonprofit organization that oversees and structures this is really all about local artists and local venues. So we're very humbled to have that opportunity to serve people. The Hudson Eye is curated annually by Erin Levi Garvey, who I'm about to introduce. And the structure is every day a 1 p.m. Hot Topics series. Issues of local concern and beyond, of course, and then a nightly program at 7:30 p.m. With exhibitions around town. This year has taken a much more walkable format, so we encourage you, if you happen to be in Hudson and be local in Hudson, you've got your public art map, which we hope you'll enjoy, hopefully as an antidote to the pandemic that we are still navigating. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the City of Hudson, its Common Council and its leadership, its aldermen, the Hudson Tourism Board and Project Hudson, as well as the J.M. Kaplan Fund, Humanities New York, and our little anonymous angels that make this local match possible every year. A special shout out to Hudson Hall, where many of us kind of running this series are anchored, and Tambra Dillon and her staff. So this is Erin Levi Garvey, who hails from the Hudson Valley, and he curates this annually. This will also drop online after Labor Day Monday. So thank you so much, and it's our honor to have speakers like this today.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our final hot topic of the Hudson Eye 2020. This has been one for the books. This year has been a wild year for everyone involved, but we've been able to maintain a community and navigate safely a touchless humanities series while still speaking essentially face to face. Today we have Peak Local, who is an artist in Hudson, organized by Rebecca Wolff. Three directors and founders of the literary organization will share their perceptions of the instrumentalization of artists and arts organizations in gentrification process and the construction of artistic community, as well as it really happens both within and without the binding apparatus of professionalism. This discussion features Rebecca Wolff, author and founder and editor and publisher of the independent press called Fence; Tessa Kelly, an architect and the director of Mastheads, a public humanities project in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, as well as writer and Fence collaborator Christopher Stackhouse. Hope everyone enjoys. Thank you for attending this afternoon. At the close of the talk between our panelists, what we will do is upgrade all of our attendees to panelist format, so then we can have a face-to-face Q&A conversation with everyone that's in attendance today. So over to you, Rebecca. Enjoy, everyone.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Great. I do really appreciate being asked to participate in this local arts festival, and I have really enjoyed what I've been able to participate in so far. And I'm very happy to have with me here today two collaborators and fellow literary arts experiencers and organizers and workers. And we're going to speak, each of us first, and then we'll just have a little conversation. And so first I'm going to have Tessa Kelly present.
Great. Let me. Rebecca, can you just confirm that you can see my screen?
I can see your screen.
Great. Okay, so I am an architect, and I'll explain as this talk goes on how I came to be in this conversation of literary arts organizations. But I'm going to start by showing two images by the photographer Gregory Crewdson of Pittsfield, Massachusetts, which is where I'm from and where I work. And Pittsfield is number 21 on the list of the nation's fastest shrinking cities. And it's the only metro area in New England to be on this list. So these two images you see on the screen, the left is an image of downtown Pittsfield, and the right is an image of the West Side neighborhood, which we will get to later on, immediately west of North Street, which you see on the other side of the page. So this is an image from kind of the earliest moment of the Mastheads project, as it's now known, which began as an architectural provocation when I was completing my architecture degree. And what you see here is kind of a skeletal model of Herman Melville's homestead in Pittsfield, with one little solid corner built out and copied here and put onto its own legs to kind of take Melville's study out of his house, which sits on a site in Pittsfield, bring it out into the community and make it active. So this project was all about thinking about the context of a place that is experiencing loss of population, loss of identity, loss of morale, and to look back into the history of a place to uncover important historical moments that could be brought back to the forefront to create new programming and architecture within the city. So amazingly, 6 years ago, we received a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts to build the mastheads. So on the top left here, you see 5 mastheads studios. The reason we use the term mastheads for this project is that in Moby Dick, Ishmael talks about the sailors taking turns climbing up into the masthead, and talks about that space and that scale of space, which is just the size for a single body, being a position from which one gets a new vantage point on their surroundings, and that from that position, one has a new opportunity and invitation to think differently and to record one's thoughts. So what we built were 5 mobile writing studios. Each one is 8 feet square and is built onto a trailer base that can be pulled around the city and activate different sites. And the purpose of this project was to create a living representation of a very significant history in Pittsfield that many residents and visitors were not aware of. So the 5 masthead studios are each designed after fragments of the structures where 5 American Renaissance authors were working in Pittsfield during the mid-19th century. So Melville, Thoreau, Hawthorne, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and Longfellow. And we use these studios to host a writer's residency every July. And we also use the overall structure of the project to run a series of public humanities events and research initiatives each year that expand the investigation into Pittsfield's role in the development of literary culture throughout the US. So I want to talk a little bit about how this project moved from being an architectural provocation to being a public humanities project. And the first step in how that happened was through partnering with a poet, Sarah Trudgeon, and a literary scholar, Jeff Lawrence, and creating a three-part conversation between architecture, creative writing, and literary scholarship. So through that partnership, we have continued to cite the Mastheads studios throughout Pittsfield and to bring Pittsfield Public School students into those spaces to write, in addition to our yearly writers residency, which takes place in July. And we have also expanded what we do beyond the studios themselves to activate other spaces throughout the city of Pittsfield. So these are two photographs of installations that took place this July. We installed 78 lines of text from the 5 writers in residence who were part of the Mastheads this summer throughout locally owned Pittsfield essential businesses. So on the left, you'll see the staircase at Carr Hardware with a fragment of a poem by Jessica Lazar. On the right, you'll see one of Pittsfield's oldest family-owned supermarkets, Harry's, where one of the 2 brothers who runs the supermarket, Bob Nichols, who runs the butcher department, every week does these hand-lettered signs in the front window. And you'll see on the bottom his rendition of 2 lines from another one of our poets this year: the marshmallow of love, the marshmallow of more sleep, below pepper and onion beef patties and beer can chicken thighs. 2 more here. On the right, a floor installation at Elm Street Hardware, things that simply jump at you, next to a pile of coiled up garden hoses. And then in the cheese department at Guido's, but we are the shared room now. We are the everything. So one of the things that the Mastheads is doing in the city of Pittsfield is to think beyond the confines of a building as sort of the limits of an architectural practice. And for me, very much the process has been instead to think about the city as a whole, as a system of spaces and signs that can be activated and utilized in different ways to try to engage and touch as many residents as we can with this project. So also this summer, we installed 6 billboards throughout the city of Pittsfield, each bright yellow, each with a word that was a guiding theme of each in the top left corner, and then a compilation of 3 lines of text, the first from a Pittsfield Public School student in our Poetry in Schools program, the second from a famous Pittsfield or Berkshire author, and the third from one of this year's writers in residence. So on the left, scale. I'm big, but I'm small. Wouldn't you like a drop of something to pick you up? I never get caught. And on the right, color. Blue is inside of my body, blacker than 100 midnights, the marshmallow of stay with me. And finally, this is an image of newspaper inserts that we produce on summer Sundays. And these go to 30,000 doorsteps each issue. So the Mastheads is continuing to evolve. We're in our 4th year right now, but our process is a kind of a continual expansion of thinking about how these 3 fields of architecture and design, creative writing, and literary scholarship can come together to reach residents, to improve quality of life, to uplift a local heritage, and to, in as many ways as possible, find and specifically target and tailor programming and the release of objects into the public sphere and the activation of spaces to make this really a community project. The next project that I'm going to share kind of built off of many of the lessons of the Mastheads is called the Westside Riverway Park. This park, we also got a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts to run a robust community engagement phase. And that component of working closely with a community and a set of residents to start a design project long before a design is actually put onto paper, but to start a conversation where we kind of build the program for a project and the kind of guiding principles and ideas for a project with a community. That started with the Mastheads, and we've now started to develop this as our way of working with the city or a city. So these are all images. The Westside Riverway Park, the bottom left, you'll see, was slated to become the 8th city-owned park in a neighborhood called the West Side, which you saw an image of at the very beginning by Gregory Crudson. Residents of the West Side, one of the first things that we learned upon starting community engagement for this project was that they did not want a park here. You know, one of our earliest challenges was to figure out what people wanted to happen in their neighborhood and to use the tools that we had as the architects to as closely shape this park around their wishes. So what people really wanted, what we learned, was a community center. So through 1 year before the beginning of design and 1 year now since the initiation of construction, we've been working with a neighborhood group called the West Side Legends, which has over 2,000 neighborhood members, to plan and program this space as the community center that they want, although it's an outdoor community center, which is in the floodplain where we can't actually create a building. But we've actually started to enact the use of this space before the park is actually completed. These are some images of where the park currently is during we're almost wrapping up the construction phase, but the park wound up kind of being focused around this concept of block parties and wanting to bring back the block party and designing this park as a space that could host this kind of beloved tradition of the past, which had died over the past generation. So this is actually an image taken yesterday at a chalk festival being held on the street, right? You can see right outside of the construction fencing here. While the project is wrapping up, this was a festival put together by the Pittsfield Neighborhood Action Team to welcome the park, to engage with the park even before it's complete. These are some magnets that we produced. Together we created the West Side Riverway Park, and some kids doing an installation of those magnets along one of the storage containers at the front of the park. So again, I think these magnets kind of speak to a multi-layered process that we've developed, where through in-person events, activation of space, and the creation of objects, keepable take-home objects that kind of represent and act as relics of this engagement process, we create this holistic way of expanding the role of architecture from just designing and administering a construction process to something that can actually represent and reflect back to a stakeholder group a meaningful community process. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Christopher.
Hello there. Can you guys hear me? Yes. Rebecca invited me to be on this panel to talk or to engage with conversation about what constitutes local, hence peak local. And in thinking about it, as an artist and a writer, I had to evaluate for myself, where have I been local? Where could I consider myself an artist from? I spent a lot of time in the Hudson Valley, went to Bard for graduate school. Prior to that, many visits. The first time I ever went to the Hudson Valley ever was on a trip to the illustrators, the couple who illustrated children's books, Donald Cruz and Ann Jonas. Their daughter, Nina Cruz, invited me along with some friends, of which I came along with, to their place in Germantown. And they had renovated a farmhouse and created a studio there. I believe Ann Jonas has passed away, but I believe her husband, her widower, Donald Cruz, is still alive and still there. They had created a beautiful studio and had a really charming renovated farmhouse there. And that was in '95, I believe, was the first time I was up there. Since then, one of the things that's been interesting about locality in the Hudson Valley is many of the artists that I've come into contact with as a critic, as a curator, as a writer, as an editor, I would say probably about 50 to 60% of the folks that I've met in New York City had spent time in the Hudson Valley, usually at Bard. A couple of people have gone to Vassar, a couple other schools in the area. But I found that there was this very strong community of creators that had either spent time there, lived there, or used it as a kind of thoroughfare in the country. And by that I mean through their travels to, say, Los Angeles or Chicago or Detroit or New York City proper, or Philadelphia, or wherever. So many of them had made their way through that area. And so that begs the question, what is that scene now? How has it evolved to be what it is at this moment? And what's really fascinating to me is that it centers really on the town of Hudson for the most part. That is like feels at the moment as the central location for artistic activity in the Hudson Valley. The galleries there, the shops, the vacationing, et cetera, Where I'm from is, and how this complicates things for me, particularly the subject of artists arriving at a place, making their contribution either residually or very intentionally, is watching it happen in various places that actually affect me directly. So I was born in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I grew up in an area called Easttown in Grand Rapids. And Easttown is, now if you do a search on Easttown in Grand Rapids, Michigan, they refer to it, which is giving a inflated description of what it is, but they refer to it as the East Village of Grand Rapids, which, when I was there was no Google, there was no internet the way that there is now, and we certainly didn't feel at that point back in the 80s and early 90s that Grand Rapids was any kind of artistic hub like that. Although it has turned the corner, and there's lots of activity there now. But when I go back home, when I go back to Grand Rapids, I go to a neighborhood that I don't recognize, which is a really interesting thing for me. It's interesting because I've watched that happen in Park Slope, which, I watched it happen in the East Village. When I first arrived to New York in '93, I spent most of my time in what they call the East Village. And it's, I haven't been there to that part of New York City in, years. And whenever I do step in there, it's unrecognizable to me. I don't recognize it at all. I do go back to Park Slope on a regular basis, once or twice a month to look at my apartment. But when I'm there, it's almost unrecognizable. It doesn't feel as creative as it once was. When I first moved to my apartment there in Park Slope in 1995, I'm on Fifth Avenue between Carroll and Garfield. And that avenue, Fifth Avenue, from where now the Barclay Center is, all the way down to probably 16th Street or so, was filled with artist run spaces or artists working in storefronts with the occasional bodega. But it was basically artists and writers that lived there. And it's fascinating, again, to watch how these artists, these writers, these creative people basically came to come into these communities, East Village on one note, Park Slope in downtown Brooklyn on another, and bring with them a kind of aura that basically indicates a coming kind of security, like it harbingers some kind of economic activity that it then indicates some kind of social attention that manifests itself through economical means, and then becomes safe for a group of people who just come to kind of exploit the and mine the developments that creative people develop or create. And it's an interesting thing to watch, and it's there's part of me that feels in some ways that it's hostile, like that there's this kind of hostility, particularly when I look at it in Park Slope. There are people there that don't recognize that families have been there for generations. I have a friend who lived above me, her son lives there now. Rosalind Beck is her name. And she grew up in Park Slope, and she's African-American woman, Black woman. And, over the last 20 years, every time I'd see her, she'd just be a little bit more anxious about the community. And the last time I saw her, she said, she's like, I can't do this anymore. I can't live here. I have to get out of here. It's just not my neighborhood anymore. Mind you, she grew up 3 blocks away from where she had rented the apartment. One of the last straws for her was her mother, who is at the time in her mid 80s, leaned on a bike rack about 2 or 3 blocks down from their apartment. And she's an older woman, she uses a cane, obviously she's in her 80s, she stopped to lean on a bike rack. And a young white woman walks up to this older Black woman and says, excuse me, could you please move so I can tie my dog up on this bike rack? And Rosalind's mother just looked at her and said, no, I can't move. I'm not moving. I'm tired. I need to rest, and you can tie your dog up somewhere else. And there was this brief moment of that's very specific and very heightened kind of contact that is complicated. Is very, very complicated. And what underlies that for me when I saw it is, of course, all the race and the class things and the difference in generation and age and what constitutes propriety, but that kind of subtle violence that is the residue of gentrification is an interesting finale, in a way, to artists coming into a community and actually making that community functional for people who would have not otherwise thought so. So that's one way of looking at it. And I look at it I think about it in terms of home. I think about it because my mother still lives in the house that I was raised in for the most part. We've had the house since 1974. And she goes through that she's a little tougher. She's a bit spriter. And, you know, the community there is very, very tight knit. So the same kind of disregard that would happen in, say, Brooklyn or New York, where the volume of population is so much that, you know, those kinds of slights or those kinds of conflicts or those kinds of contact go really pretty much unnoticed until they boil over into a larger problem, as we're seeing all over the country right now. But there, everyone is pretty much understands the rules. But at the same time, our old neighborhood, which was mixed race, filled with artists, working class people, white collar folks, filled with churches, that sort of thing, has now become near monolithic, with the exception of some old Black families that have been there for a long time, mine included. So that's an interesting thing about thinking about locality and origin. Two things that are a little bit separate from that. I am one of the co-founders of a project called This Red Door, which you can look up. I believe the website is still operative. It's called This Red Door. I was founded with a guy named Joe Marstack and another fellow, Jared Friedman. And what we did, which was also interesting about locality, is and trying to really instrumentalize maybe, or actually in some ways I would say this, let's say this at some risk, weaponize creativity. We started in the East Village, and we ended up doing various installations, exhibitions. We took our project to different cities, Berlin, Copenhagen, a couple of different places, Hamburg. What we would do is we would go into these communities, take over a space, and essentially open the space for the community to use it. That we would bring in a table and some chairs. We would bring in installation equipment, tools. We'd set up Wi-Fi. Slowly, we would bring furniture and different works of art. During our first iteration, I brought about 1,000 books of my own in for public use. We did the first one at PS1 in Manhattan. We had an open program. We would show anyone, we would let anyone speak. We would let anyone do anything that was feasible and safe in the space, and create an exhibition schedule or an event schedule on the fly. And so it allowed us to show hundreds of artists in a very short period of time. It also allowed us to let the community speak, which I think is a very important thing. You know, one of my favorite elements of This Red Door is that the programming and the events and what happens in those spaces, in the spaces that we created, were essentially guided by the people that were around us. So basically you hand the community some form of infrastructure, some framework, a building with the basic necessities, a bathroom and Wi-Fi and some places to sit, and let them build and decide what it is that they want to see or what they want to hear. And it worked really well. I left This Red Door because in 2015, in the beginning of the mess that we're in right now, I wanted to go to Jackson, Mississippi, and I wanted to go to Gary, Indiana, and I wanted to go to, you know, small towns in Arkansas. I wanted to make our way up to, you know, a tiny town in Montana or Wyoming, because I felt like what we were doing was giving communities a chance to express themselves to their fullest capacity, but with a diverse experience. And so you don't turn anyone down, you don't turn anyone away. You let communities speak. You give them a microphone, you make them audible, you give them some volume. And with the web and the way that we program things, we could do that. We have a following at the time, you know, in Europe and here in the States. And I thought that that would be an active way to get particularly the American citizenry, the American polity on the same page, because when you hear everyone speak individually and freely together in a way where they can actually hear each other or listen to each other, or even speak past or listen through or not listen to, but just be in the same space to hear each other speak, you start to realize that people are actually saying some of the very same things. And I think that there's a potential for...
I hate to interrupt at all because you are saying some fascinating things and I'm just watching the clock. And I feel like we should pause you there so that we have time. We only have till 2, I'm pretty sure. So,
okay.
So I'm gonna...
Yeah, I'll wrap it up there.
Yeah, cool.
There is room for a reevaluation of what locality means, and we should definitely think about what artists contribute and how they do to gentrification.
Thank you for wrapping that up so succinctly. I guess I'm going to speak for a little bit, and I'm hoping that, you know, both of you spoke very eloquently about what happens when art is programmed into a city, or what can happen when art is programmed into a city, and how that can, you know, the intention behind that. What are the I want to say beautiful intentions behind that, and what are the ways that that we can keep like the beauty of that intact as we go forward. So I'm gonna just read a statement that I wrote, and I'm not sure if am I the visible one now? Okay. So this statement I wrote is called Peak Local. My sense of urgency makes me utter extremities. And I'm gonna read it really quickly because I feel like it's, and if I have to stop, I have to stop. And maybe somebody can tell me when we only have 10 minutes or something for questions. Thank you for having us here today to talk about the local and who is an artist in Hudson. This week has brought you an open-hearted yet touchless, deep curation of the hopeful arts, the communal arts, the arts that are made even in, or especially in and through, times of trouble. Its intention is to act as a bridging force between the city and the creative economy. Arts programming is indeed an industry. It draws upon and supports, it necessitates and perpetuates, it motivates cycles of creation and waste. I am an artist in Hudson, the author of 4 books of poems, 1 novel, numerous essays, but that is not how I typically represent within the local. Today, in order to speak with authority about the twinning, swanning, lockstep forces of arts professionalization and urban gentrification, I am representing Fence, an independent literary press of which I am founding editor. I am not incidentally an alderperson in the 1st Ward on the Common Council of the City of Hudson. In me are united the desire to make art and the desire to make interventions in the power structure for the benefit of the greater good. My desire to make art is persistent, and my talent at making it is confirmed within the arts establishment. The products of my talent are worldwide. I am glad to have these locals here with me today. They each live somewhere and they are or are not from there. They each have stakes and movement and memory. They came from something and they bring it with them. Artists often don't stay where they came from. They make exodus, they are exile, they take a backwards look and they register and record the impulse to make something new in one's new place. When I came to Hudson in 2005, I and my fellow Aravistes planned to make a school for this, a school for that, a food co-op, the things the city didn't have and we thought it needed. I wanted to answer some needs. Over time, I perceived those needs to be lower in the hierarchy of needs than I had perceived initially. The hierarchy of needs describes what must be in place in order for an organism to have the capacity to pursue exalted consciousness. Shelter is a basic need. Possibly even more basic is the need for a livable environment, air and water. I perceived a local need for housing justice in Hudson. Globally, we perceive a need for climate preservation. Artists need to make art, and they will do that or die. They will also do it for money. They will do it site-specifically if provided with the resources to make art in a specific site. They will come to your city if curated into your show. They will fly around the world if tickets are purchased. The habit of frequent travel has become something of a barometer of the success of an artist. How often do you pack your bags? Where are your most particular services required? Now that we are all situated for the time being where we are situated, we are reintroduced to the persistent needs of our places. This is an amplification of what the exigencies of our climate have been requiring from us steadily, but almost inaudibly, minus the fanfare of the pandemic. I'm going to skip a little bit that I wrote about fence particularly, but just to say that I edit our books and literary periodical in my home on Union Street, where I also raise my children, do freelance editorial consulting for money, and participate in local government as an elected official and housing advocate. Our geographic spread, our editorial geographic spread is intentional, for Fence was formulated explicitly as non-regional, non-social, non-local, not even regional or social to Hudson. Our intention is not to reproduce a particular literary community or ideological lineage, but rather to keep space for the writing and art that exquisitely interrelates between communities and agendas. I have kept a low profile in Hudson as a literary editor. For many years, my editors have not met as a group, although it has been contemplated. Now, there is a prohibition against meeting as a group. Now, airplane flight must be prohibited forever because airplane travel contributes prohibitively to climate change emergency and should be limited only to the most exigent flights, the ones without which it will be impossible for something extraordinarily beneficial for the greatest good for the most people alive on Earth. And then I'm skipping more about Fence. Or I'm just going to read it. The early rhetoric of Fence in its energetic formation was inflammatory to Marxist poetics critics. The stated goal of Fence to essentially disarm literary communities, dismantle social networks that produce aesthetic homogeneity, could also be read as a neoliberal bootstrapping hyper-individualist agenda aiming to disorient and nullify anti-capitalist critiques of dominant culture language usage. I was brash at the time, and my defense against these critiques, which stung, for was I not creating a beautiful and accessible venue, amounted to, the poetics you seek to defend in this critique of Fence have not produced significant social or political benefit to warrant this attack on what is essentially a liberatory organ. A local art scene is one that the artist has often sought to transcend in order to confirm their talent. Hudson is a city, and the artists here now come from everywhere to make a scene, as Chris pointed out, and as will happen in Pittsfield, and is happening in Pittsfield too. Hudson's local has been made global. This happened not overnight, but with careful planning and progress in the arts industrialization sector. Curators, programmers, space makers, gallerists, advisors, collectors, investors, real estate developers are tipped off to opportunity by certain anchors, bright among them the presence of artists and the arts culture they produce, a creative economy. Artistic production of art culture is an anchor for those who will capitalize on opportunity. This capitalization is a disaster for artists, not only because it means you cannot live here any longer and that you have participated in the displacement of those who lived here before you and now cannot live here any longer, but also because it means that your art and your art production has been successfully consumed as fuel. The median annual income in the city of Hudson is $36,000. Hudson was shielded from the perception of opportunity for a long time by its poverty. Hudson is protected no longer, for though the poverty remains, the shield has been burnished by local artisans, and in its reflective surface, the world sees an image. New locals, makers, the promises of services that wealth desires for upkeep of wealthy lives. I therefore exhort artists to make interventions within the structure of the literal government, in the language of the government, and with the tools of the government. I call this movement literalism, and I suggest that it is an appropriate end-stage response. It is the collapsing into each other of the twin towers of metaphor and power. Artists have power to make meaning, and the meaning structure of power, the government, is vulnerable to artists. Artists in Hudson read Hudson as metaphor for Pittsfield, for Grand Rapids, are responsible and powerful, and can detach from the structure of arts professionalization, which turns them into tools of gentrification and the status quo. As an elected official, I sit on a board that is negotiating a proposal from a hotel developer. And we're negotiating it on Tuesday, and everyone who's listening should come to the IDA meeting at which it will be negotiated. In this deal, the developer would receive a tax break from the city, promising employment for local people in return, among other benefits. The hotel developer has expressed his passion for the local Hudson scene, local artists, local food, local landscape architects, the local in general, and the design of his boutique hotel expresses this as well. He has hired a team of architects from Chatham. His food consultants are from, I believe, Rhinebeck. And if he were allowed to, he would stop there in his exploration of the local. He does not know yet what local means in Hudson. I am going to force him to commit to training and hiring underemployed residents of Hudson. Local is not a brand. Localism is not a consumer perspective. Localism is not about knowing the pedigree of the artisan of the pillow. The local is a vulnerable population. When you say you are hiring local workers, we are going to specify the vulnerable population that needs to benefit from your development of their city. I have one more paragraph, thank you. Pittsfield, Massachusetts is in the corridor of small cities which are going to need to defend their vulnerable populations from the purchasing power of those who will recognize the beds that have been laid for them by artists. And I want to extend that to what I'm saying is not that artists are at fault for laying this bed, but that artists are functionalized. Arts organizations and arts programming produce safety and security for real estate developers. They therefore produce danger and displacement for low-income populations. An essay by Jeff Lawrence of the Mastheads in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, on the Gilded Age of Wealth in the Berkshires and its literary production quotes from a biography of Edith Wharton. One of Wharton's great achievements is to have written, quote, with hard, penetrating, analytical realism about a society, and this is quoting Edith Wharton, wholly absorbed in barricading itself against the unpleasant. That is me quoting Jeff Lawrence, quoting Wharton's biographer, quoting Edith Wharton as she describes what people do when they bring their wealth to a place where their wealth buys more than the local wealth can buy. They colonize. I'm gonna stop there and hope that we are going to have a conversation. I have a really cute little bit about, I'm just gonna say one more thing, I'm sorry. In Hudson, New York, we are presented with conditions for social justice. We have artists, farmers, wealth, poverty, citizens of color, undocumented residents of color, and progressive citizens. Why do I think that artists have a specific responsibility in this time to cease their participation in gentrification and global climate change to actively work to resist these forces? It's because it seems to me that art has not worked. Art is amazing. I love art. In fact, I am art and I make art, but art's interventions demonstrably do not work hard enough or fast enough to save the world. My sense of urgency makes me utter extremities. In 1971, Joni Mitchell's song Big Yellow Taxi, with its entreaty, give me spots on my apples, but leave me the birds and the bees, was number 67 on the charts. But this art song did not stop Roundup from virtually eradicating winged insects in 2020. And then I just need to get to the little part where I say, what if all the artists in the entire world, everyone who identifies as an artist, rose up with one voice and said, artists ban airplanes? Okay, thank you. Yeah, I would love to, in conversations that Tessa and I have had previously, just talking about collaborations or possible collaborations between our organizations, we've touched on this question of what does a city do when it doesn't perceive itself to be fighting gentrification, but instead perceives itself to be fighting collapse or economic, real economic straits, which then make it wish to be developed, or make it wish to welcome new people. Like, so Tessa, you mentioned Pittsfield is shrinking, and I'm curious if you could say more about that, because Hudson is shrinking too, quite considerably over the last decade, or even, it's remarkable. In fact, I believe it's about half the population that it had at its height. And part of that shrinking is the conversion of multifamily homes to single homes. Even if they were originally single homes, they've now been converted back to single homes. And it's also, people moving here to have second homes, so the population is not increased by those homes. So anyway, yeah, Tessa, I just wonder if you could say anything about that. Oops, we can't hear you, Tessa, I'm sorry.
Sorry about that. Yeah, Rebecca, one of the things that you just said that really struck me and that I would love to think more about with you is I kind of talked about how I love to look out for these different media through which to convey and explore ideas, but the one that you brought up, which is artists speaking the language of government, or artists using the language of government as an actual mechanism to enact their work, really strikes me as a provocation that I would love to think about how artists in similarly situated cities would educate themselves on and then explore and riff on using that language and things like zoning regulations. And I feel like the average person just doesn't understand those things regardless of what their intentions are. So it really keeps the power in the hands of a very few set of people that actually know what's going to come in the next 10 or 20 years based on the rules that they're writing. And I just wonder what a method might be for educating more people about those rules and how they're written and what they lead to. And since we last spoke, which was maybe a month or two ago, there have been opportunities that have been brought to me by developers who are noticing that Pittsfield has rock bottom prices right now, and are noticing the work that I've been doing in the city and wanting to involve me in various types of development projects. And so I think I've been very slow to figure out how to respond to these things, but I think the question of how to use that language and how to almost create ground rules for how these relationships happen is something that I'd like to think more about.
That's cool. And can you hear me? Yes. It's very interesting, these languages, these two languages. There's the art language, which long ago was talked about as being a, you know, I mean, there's the cultural elite, like the problem of the protected or specialized knowledge of a field like within the arts world. And then I have definitely experienced getting to know the government. It's like fluency, as you say, fluency in the actual construct that runs our actual lives is very low, as you're saying. And I'm on a super steep learning curve as an elected official, learning how to speak the speech of it. And I actually did, through Fence, I have issued a solicitation for exactly that, writers who want to think about, the way I phrase it is what does it sound like when you're trying to be understood? Because generally when we make art, we don't concern ourselves with, you know, we try not to consider audience in a way that would limit what we actually feel motivated to do as an artist. You know what I mean? Like, so and however, when speaking to, in public, you know, we're like, as of an elected official, I'm actually required, my speech is public by law. Like, I have to speak in public in a way that I can be understood. It's a challenge for me. But I try to meet it. But the question of how to bring more people, more artists, and or sometimes actually more the populations whose lives are being most direly affected, like how to bring people into this government conversation is really challenging. And in Hudson, I don't know what it's like in Pittsfield, but in Hudson, you know, I issued invitations long before I was elected. I was trying to issue invitations to people to just come to the Common Council meetings as a means of kind of bolstering democracy, just in a general way. Like, this is actually the democratic process. So I was, you know, so please come and be part of the process of democracy, no matter whether you have a special interest right now or not, whether you feel threatened right now or not, whether you have a complaint or not. And that hasn't, you know, it didn't result in too much right then, but then more recently, I actually explicitly requested artists in Hudson, along the same lines of what I was just putting out there, to kind of convert their engagement into engagement with the local political world. So yeah, but I would love to talk about this more with you, and maybe.
And I'll look into your solicitation.
Yes, I will make sure to send it to you, and I'll, yeah. So it sounds like we just have a couple minutes, and we haven't opened this conversation to the public who are participating. Do we have any time to do that, Aaron?
Hi, Rebecca. Yeah, we have about 2 to 3 minutes left. So what we're going to do is get everyone upgraded to panelist form in just a moment. And then just field any questions or comments that have come up. I know, I'm sure we have a number of community members that have some interest. Yeah.
And as that happens on the technical end, Aaron, and thank you, panelists, we really want to start by saying thank you for such incredibly rich content and points of view. While that occurs, because this is actually, the 16 participants are going to be upgraded to speakers and panelists, I would like to harmonize with the panel and also make a bridge here by sharing something that just says, this is actually from the Hudson Eye, because I took that little cue from you, Rebecca, and thank you for it. What if the growth of Hudson could acknowledge its own vast diversity, economy, its growing art world scene, its status as a dance and performance epicenter in the world, the design values which are occurring and which are contested, its local organizations, its literary achievements, its small businesses, its housing needs in a positive and interconnected cycle. So that's something I was just typing in response to these really rich prompts which came up. And we hope that we will open this out in addition to saying thank you.
Thank you for that, Jonah. And I do also hope to figure out ways to positively approach that whole concept of you know, because I can be a real downer, obviously, and I think that we have nowhere to go but, you know, together and upward. So there you go.
So with this upgrade feature, we certainly don't want to put anyone on the spot, but and we have the opportunity to have such incredible local participation, as well as maybe performers, other artists that have been in the festival, other local elected members. Thank you for, in a way that provocates. We're here to field this. Respectfully, so.
Great.
Or group hug, we could do a group hug. But I think I think the panel.
Oops, you're going in. Are there no questions? If there's no questions,
I have a question. I'd like to ask Tessa a question. Can you hear me, Tessa?
I can.
I'm a poet and a painter here in Hudson, and I wondered if you'd had any community feedback from the project that involved poetry on those billboards, which I found a fascinating idea, and wondered if it was effective in a way that you could measure.
You know, some of the things that we put out there, it's very hard to understand how they are impacting people. For instance, with the newspaper inserts, we know that they make it to 30,000 doorsteps. With the billboards, we don't really know who sees them, or if I did recently get a comment from some people on North Street, which is Pittsfield's most busy street, saying how much they loved finding the yellow billboards around town. And so they did connect the pieces between those 6. But the feedback specifically on the billboards is very anecdotal. When we were planning the billboards, we reached out to the superintendent's office of the Pittsfield Public School to get the permission to put the kids' lines of poetry on there. So I know that their families were alerted, and the community of teachers and administrators were very enthusiastic about them. But unfortunately, I don't really, we didn't really figure out a way to solicit feedback or measure the impact that they were having.
Thank you.
It looks like there's a lot of chat, but I'm not sure. Or no, I'm sorry. This is just, never mind.
Maybe Jeff has a question.
Yeah, I'm hesitating. I think it's a broad question. So, and I know that we don't have that much more time, so you can feel free to take it up. But I was just thinking, I mean, kind of putting all 3 of these presentations together, and just, especially Christopher, I was thinking about obviously, like, community. When one talks about community, that is constantly shifting over time, and particularly through the process of gentrification, that, like, so one things of, like, getting people in the community to come, or asking the community different things, like, that's as you said, I think that's a very complex issue. And I don't know, I mean, I've also, so sorry, I should say that I'm involved in the Mastheads project. That should, just for a little bit of a context. And I was also thinking, Tessa, that in terms of thinking about some of the issues that maybe we've had in the Mastheads that we've tried to address over the years, one of them, I think, has been that we tend to get particular type, or tended at the beginning to get a particular type of community member who was already going to all of the other art stuff in the Berkshires. And to a certain degree, I feel like it's with the West Side, when you were describing the West Side project, where it's very clearly like a rooted community that is providing feedback and shaping the process of, you know, of what that, not a park, but a community center. And I just know how much that's influenced your way of thinking about our programming in the Mastheads. So I don't, maybe that's a reflection. I don't, or it could be a question about like the definition of community in the context of places. And obviously Brooklyn would be a place like that, but I think also, you know, Hudson and Pittsfield, where whether through gentrification or deindustrialization, like the very definition of community seems to be changing. So I'll just leave it at that if there are thoughts that any of the three of you have on that.
I think as you were speaking, I was musing on why it is, I mean, I was further continuing to muse on why it is that, or how it has become so that an art project would be so essentially siloed, I guess is the contemporary term I want to talk about, that you know, someone like Tessa is invited, you know, is invited to participate in like the potential development solely as you know, representing like the arts perspective, or, you know, that like people, I mean, I'm familiar with these kinds of consensus building processes that seem to happen in every, I don't know, venue. But in those processes, people are identified as being a certain kind of stakeholder, like you are targeted as representing a specific community, and basically expected to contribute, you know, that perspective solely to the overwhelming intention of the project. I'm not sure where I'm going with that exactly, but it's interesting because Tessa, as a native of Pittsfield, like you're bringing that perspective as well, as you
Yeah, I mean, I'll confess, I feel like I'm in sort of a terrifying place right now, where I feel like because of the success of engaging thousands of people in these two projects, I now feel a big responsibility to not make a mistake as to how I may contribute to, you know, making how I understand, or how I get the foresight in my own mind to understand how certain collaborations can actually help our city versus kind of unravel the city. So I'm kind of in this moment of crisis right now where,
oh my goodness, I
don't know. Yeah. So
we're gonna talk. Yeah, no, it is. I mean, it is. I totally relate to that crisis because, I mean, starting an arts organization that I too have had the experience of unexpected success in the founding of an arts organization. When Fence began in 1998, it was remarkably, what's a better word than successful? It gathered a large audience very quickly and got press and got funding and got, you know, lots of attention, and then was put in the position of potentially growing. And that was a choice that I made about 10 years later. I chose to kind of pull back from the growth model, essentially. But it is, you know, I mean, it's, again, it's about being perceived as a, as having, like, you bring your audience with you as an arts organization. What the currency you have, I guess, is your audience. Mm-hmm. And so it's like being an elected official. I have constituency as well, literally. But then, yeah, so the two are related. We're over time, and does anyone else have a question?
I think that, you know, this might be a good point where, you know, if we have no more questions, we can wrap it out. And this was a way to go out. This was our final hot topic for the 2020 season. So thank you, Tessa. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Christopher. Everyone that joined in and watched this broadcast. Hopefully next year we can all be together in the same room and really open it as a in-person community conversation. So thank you again, Rebecca.
Thanks.
Christopher,
Thank
Tessa,
you,
thank you so much.
Thanks, Jonah. I don't know if you're here. Bye, everybody.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.